The tow truck was already pulling away when my radio went silent. My ambulance, the one I was actively assigned to, was gone. An HOA board member stood there, arms crossed, satisfied, as if she'd just enforced a parking rule instead of disabling emergency care. That was the moment everything changed. Because less than an hour later, she did something she can never undo. She called 911. Not for a stranger, for her own husband. I didn't know it then, but that decision triggered a chain of reports, recordings, and consequences that spread far beyond our neighborhood. And right as I thought it couldn't get worse, the HOA made one final move that forced everything into the open. Before we jump into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you've ever had a crazy HOA moment, hit subscribe so you don't miss how this ends. By the time I tracked down where my ambulance had been taken, the problem wasn't just the tow. It was the realization that someone with no medical authority had decided they could interrupt an emergency unit mid-shift and face no consequences for it. I was still in uniform when I walked back through the neighborhood, radio clipped to my chest, phone vibrating with unanswered alerts. The street looked normal, clean sidewalks, trimmed lawns, flags hanging from porches, but nothing about the situation felt normal anymore. I'd lived in that HOA community for a few years without trouble. I kept to myself, paid my dues on time, followed the posted rules the same way everyone else claimed to. My job meant odd hours, sudden departures, late returns. Most neighbors understood that. Or at least, they didn't interfere. At the time, I thought that was enough. I didn't realize how visible my routine had made me. The HOA board member who'd authorized the tow had been watching for a while. I didn't know that yet. All I knew was that she'd started appearing more often when I parked, standing near her driveway, lingering near the sidewalk, pretending to check her phone. At first, it felt like coincidence. Then the emails started. Polite on the surface. Vague. Mentions of community standards and unauthorized vehicle appearance. No direct accusation. No explanation. Just enough language to make it clear someone was documenting me. I assumed it was a misunderstanding. The ambulance was clearly marked. City issued. Parked temporarily between calls. I figured common sense would handle the rest. That assumption didn't last long. A few days later, I found a printed notice taped to my door. No warning beforehand. No request for clarification. Just a citation stating I was in violation of parking restrictions and subject to enforcement. At the time, it seemed minor. A piece of paper. A technicality. I didn't realize what that notice really meant. Life continued in short bursts of normalcy. A quiet morning. A quick wave from a neighbor. Then another message from the HOA inbox. Firmer this time. Less polite. The language shifted from guidelines to penalties. From suggestions to consequences. It was subtle but deliberate. Someone was testing how far they could push without being challenged. I tried to address it through the proper channels. Submitted documentation. Explained my work schedule. Provided proof that the vehicle wasn't personal, wasn't permanent, wasn't decorative. I expected a pause. A review. Instead, the responses sped up. Shorter emails. Broader wording. References to authority instead of solutions. What stood out wasn't just the refusal to compromise, it was the confidence. The certainty that enforcement would happen whether I agreed or not. That should have been the warning sign. I didn't see it yet. The day it escalated, I was already under pressure. Calls stacking. Dispatch rerouting units. I parked where I always did, checked my equipment, and went inside to grab water. Less than 10 minutes later, the notification came through. Not from the HOA. From the tow company. That was when I realized the first action hadn't been the notice. It had been the surveillance. The documentation. The quiet build-up. The tow wasn't a mistake, it was a decision. I contacted the HOA immediately. The response was cold and procedural. They cited bylaws I'd never been shown. Claimed emergency vehicles weren't exempt unless actively responding. Ignored the fact that I had been. Ignored the risk. Ignored everything except their own authority. And then came the final message. The one that changed how I understood the situation entirely. A notice stating that future violations would result in escalating enforcement, including fines, vehicle removal, and additional remedies deemed necessary. No appeal mentioned. No timeline. Just power. I stood there reading it, realizing this wasn't about parking anymore. It was about control. And whatever they decided to do next, it wasn't going to stop with my ambulance. The tow should have been the peak of it. That's what I told myself while trying to get through the rest of that shift using borrowed equipment and borrowed patience. I focused on the job because that's what I'd always done when things felt out of control. But the HOA didn't slow down just because I needed them to. If anything, the momentum shifted in their favor. Within days, the fines started stacking. Not one large penalty, several smaller ones, spaced just far enough apart to feel intentional. Parking violations. Improper use of residential space. Failure to comply with prior notice. Each one arrived with colder language than the last. I paid the first without protest, thinking it might signal cooperation. That should have ended it, but it didn't. Paying seemed to unlock something. The next notice referenced my payment as an acknowledgement of violation. The wording was subtle, but unmistakable. I'd confirmed their authority without meaning to. When I pushed back, asking how an emergency vehicle could be treated like a decorative camper, the response wasn't an answer. It was a deadline. I started altering my routine. Parking farther away. Walking longer distances in uniform. Double-checking signs. For a brief moment, it felt like that adjustment might be enough. Then the emails expanded beyond parking. Suddenly my trash bins were a problem. Then my porch light. Then the visibility of my uniform when I stepped outside. None of it had been an issue before. Now it was all documented. Each time I corrected one thing, another appeared. That pattern didn't feel accidental. It felt like training. Pressure applied, response measured, pressure increased. What made it worse was the timing. Notices arrived on workdays. Emails landed during overnight shifts. Deadlines fell on days I was scheduled back-to-back. I'd come home exhausted, open my inbox, and see another message waiting. Calm language. Absolute authority. No flexibility. I started to realize they weren't just enforcing rules, they were exploiting my schedule. I considered requesting a hearing. The process was technically available, but the instructions were buried in dense language, and the dates conflicted with my shifts. I asked for accommodation. The reply referenced policy. Nothing else. That was the moment frustration gave way to something quieter and heavier. The sense that this wasn't designed to be resolved. Then the neighbor involvement escalated. Complaints started appearing that clearly didn't originate from the HOA office. Reports about noise at hours I wasn't home. Claims of obstruction I couldn't verify. Someone was feeding them information. Someone close enough to watch my comings and goings. I didn't know who yet, but I could feel eyes on me. I tried documenting everything. Screenshots. Photos. Time stamps. I told myself that evidence mattered. That eventually someone would have to acknowledge the pattern. That belief held for about a week. The next letter wasn't about fines. It was about compliance enforcement. A formal notice stating that continued violations could result in additional remedies, including vehicle restrictions, access limitations, and referral to external agencies. The language was intentionally vague. It didn't explain what those remedies were. It didn't have to. The implication was enough. That letter changed everything. Up until then, the conflict had stayed within the boundaries of inconvenience and money. Now it threatened my ability to work, to respond, to function. I contacted the HOA again, more firmly this time, outlining the risks. The response came back faster than usual. It didn't address the risks at all. It simply restated their authority and warned against further non-compliance. I started asking around. Quietly. Other residents admitted they'd had issues, but nothing like this. Most kept their heads down. One person mentioned the board member's history with enforcement. Another suggested I was being targeted because I stood out. Uniform. Sirens. Irregular hours. It made sense. And it made things worse. For a brief stretch, everything went quiet. No notices. No emails. No new fines. That calm should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like waiting. During that lull, I parked off-site entirely. Took longer walks. Left earlier. Came home later. The effort was exhausting, but it worked. Until it didn't. One afternoon, I found a warning sticker on my personal vehicle. Not the ambulance. Not even parked on HOA-controlled property. The violation cited patterned noncompliance. That was the phrase that stuck. Patterned. As if my existence itself had become the issue. I appealed again. This time, the response included a reminder of potential lien placement for unpaid fines. I hadn't missed a payment. It didn't matter. The message wasn't about accuracy. It was about leverage. I began to realize how small my margin for error had become. One missed email. One delayed response. One misinterpreted rule. Any of it could trigger something bigger. That awareness followed me everywhere. On calls. On drives. In quiet moments when my phone buzzed and my chest tightened before I even looked. Then came the notice about community safety. A new rule proposal, circulated internally, citing emergency vehicle visibility and neighborhood disruption. It wasn't a rule yet, but it was written as if it would be. And it referenced prior incidents. Plural. I thought that was the worst of it. I thought the towing had been their bold move, the fines their follow-through. I was wrong. The final escalation came without a letter. Without a warning. Without any attempt at communication at all. I found out when my access was blocked and my phone started lighting up at the same time. Notifications. Alerts. A missed call. Then another. That was when I understood the danger of what they'd set in motion. Because whatever authority they thought they were exercising, they'd crossed into something they couldn't control. And as I stood there, realizing what had just been triggered, I knew there was no undoing it. The day everything collided didn't start with shouting or sirens. It started with paperwork. A thick envelope waiting when I got home, heavier than the others, stamped and indexed like someone wanted it to feel official. Inside were escalation notices, enforcement summaries, and a final determination that treated my job like a nuisance instead of a necessity. Fines were consolidated. Penalties reclassified. Access restrictions formalized. It wasn't just pressure anymore. It was a declaration. I didn't realize what that packet would set in motion. I requested records the same night. Not explanations. Not favors. Records. Logs, authorizations, timestamps, communications with the tow company, and any correspondence tied to my address. The response came faster than anything before it, which told me more than the words did. They were confident. Too confident. The HOA had decided this was the moment to close ranks and force compliance. They didn't know I was done playing defense. The next move was theirs. Another enforcement action, broader than the last, citing community safety and continuity. It read like concern but carried teeth. It authorized removal without notice if a violation was anticipated. That phrasing stuck with me. Anticipated. They weren't reacting to rules anymore. They were predicting behavior and punishing it in advance. I filed formal complaints with every entity that touched emergency operations. I attached dates, maps, routes, and dispatch records. I included photographs of signage that contradicted their claims and copies of bylaws that had never been shared with me. I didn't accuse. I documented. That decision cost them everything, even if I didn't know it yet. The HOA doubled down. They circulated an internal memo framing me as non-compliant, disruptive, and resistant to governance. The language was careful but loaded. It wasn't meant to resolve anything. It was meant to justify what they'd already decided to do next. And then they did it. Another tow. Another removal authorized while I was on duty. This time there was no pretense of confusion. It was deliberate. Recorded. I stood there watching the space where my ambulance had been, feeling the weight of how far this had gone. That was the peak of their power. And the moment it broke. Because within hours, the responses started coming back. Not from the HOA. From agencies that didn't care about neighborhood politics. Questions arrived. Requests for clarification. Confirmation of timelines. I sent everything. Organized. Unemotional. The contrast mattered. The HOA tried to regain control with urgency. New notices arrived, reframing actions as misunderstandings, enforcement as safety measures, and authority as shared responsibility. The tone had shifted. The confidence cracked. They were reacting now. And they were reacting badly. Records began to surface that didn't align with their narrative. Authorization logs that didn't match dates. Enforcement approvals signed by someone without jurisdiction. Tow requests marked as routine when dispatch records showed active assignment. The paper trail told a different story than their notices ever had. And it was louder. I was summoned to a compliance review that felt less like procedure and more like containment. The materials they presented avoided specifics. Mine didn't. Every page raised another question they couldn't answer. Every timeline created another gap. I watched authority shrink in real time, not through confrontation, but through exposure. The turning point came when an external review flagged a conflict the HOA couldn't explain away. A board member's involvement crossed a line from oversight into interference. Not alleged. Documented. The room shifted. The language softened. The posture changed. Power retreated when it realized it had been seen. But the climax didn't arrive with an apology. It arrived with consequences. Enforcement actions were frozen pending review. Fines were suspended, not forgiven. Tows were flagged for audit. The HOA issued a statement about procedural recalibration that said nothing and admitted everything. The silence afterward was louder than any notice they'd ever sent. Then came the moment I hadn't planned for. The emergency call that tied everything together. The one that forced every decision into the open. The call they never thought would be connected to their actions. The records linked. The timing aligned. And suddenly this wasn't about parking or bylaws or aesthetics. It was about obstruction. About risk. About outcomes no one could ignore. Everything I thought I knew was about to be tested. The HOA scrambled. Internal emails leaked into the review process. Messages meant to reassure now read like admissions. Phrases about deterrence and example settings sat beside acknowledgments of awareness. They hadn't misunderstood. They had chosen. And choice carries weight. I felt the pressure shift from my shoulders to theirs. Not relief. Not victory. Just gravity changing direction. The board member at the center of it went quiet. Communications rerouted. Authority delegated. The system that had pushed so hard suddenly tried to disappear behind procedure. The final escalation landed as a consolidated notice from outside the community. Not a ruling. Not a resolution. A finding. Preliminary, but devastating. It outlined concerns, identified failures, and recommended actions that couldn't be undone. Names weren't redacted. Dates weren't flexible. The story was fixed now. I stood there reading it, realizing the climax wasn't the tow or the fines or the threats. It was the moment their power met accountability and lost. And just as the weight of that sank in, another update arrived. One that hinted at what the fallout would look like once this moved beyond review and into consequence. That was when I understood this wasn't over. It was only past the point of return. It didn't end with a dramatic announcement or a single ruling that wiped everything clean. It ended slowly, the way consequences usually do. In stages. In paperwork. In quiet shifts of authority that were impossible to reverse once they started. The first confirmation came weeks after that preliminary finding. Enforcement actions tied to my address were formally withdrawn. Not paused. Withdrawn. The language mattered. Fines were rescinded without admission of wrongdoing, which was as close to an apology as the HOA would ever allow itself. Tow authorizations linked to emergency vehicles were flagged as improper and removed from standing procedures. What had once been framed as community order was now officially labeled a failure of governance. It took months to settle, but the lesson was clear early on. The board member who had driven most of the enforcement didn't disappear overnight. Instead, responsibilities were quietly reassigned. Communications stopped coming from her name. Meetings were rescheduled. Then postponed. Then restructured. By the time her resignation was acknowledged, it was framed as a personal decision unrelated to the situation. No one believed that. The timing told the truth. The HOA itself didn't collapse. That wasn't how this ended. But its posture changed permanently. New language appeared in bylaws. Emergency vehicle exemptions were clarified, not vaguely suggested. Enforcement required layered approvals instead of unilateral action. Transparency clauses were added because someone had proven what happened without them. Neighbors reacted in ways I hadn't expected. Some apologized privately. Others admitted they'd been afraid to say anything while it was happening. A few stayed distant, uncomfortable with how visible the fallout had been. The community didn't unify. It recalibrated. And that recalibration came with tension that still hasn't fully settled. My standing changed too. Not in the way people imagine. There was no victory parade. No public recognition. What I gained was something quieter. The notices stopped. The scrutiny lifted. I parked without checking signs twice. I walked out the door without bracing for another email. The constant edge that had followed me for months finally dulled. But it didn't disappear. The experience altered how I saw authority in small places. How easily procedure can become power. How quickly rules meant to organize can be used to dominate when no one pushes back. I hadn't been targeted because I broke rules. I'd been targeted because I fit a pattern that made enforcement easy, visible, predictable, inconvenient. The call that tied everything together, the one that exposed the cost of their decisions, was never mentioned publicly. It didn't need to be. It existed in records that mattered more than neighborhood gossip. It became part of why oversight agencies asked harder questions and why the HOA couldn't retreat into silence. Some outcomes don't need to be announced to be understood. Financially, the damage didn't end with refunded fines. The HOA absorbed legal fees, consulting costs, and audit expenses that rippled through the community budget. Dues increased the following year. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Control had come at a cost, and everyone paid for it. Property values didn't crash. That wasn't the story. But trust did. Attendance at meetings spiked, then thinned. Residents who had never read a bylaw started asking for copies. Power didn't vanish. It became visible. And once that happens, it never fully goes back to how it was. For me, the final resolution wasn't a document or a decision. It was the moment I realized I could walk through my neighborhood without feeling watched. That the system that had pressed down so hard now moved around me instead of through me. That mattered more than any formal outcome. What seemed like the end was really just the beginning of something else. A community more cautious. An HOA more restrained. A reminder etched into policy instead of memory. I still work the same job. Still keep odd hours. Still respond when the call comes in. But I no longer assume common sense will protect me. I document. I verify. I ask questions early. Not because I'm paranoid, but because I've seen how quickly minor issues become leverage when no one intervenes. Sometimes I think about how close this came to ending differently. How a single unchecked decision cascaded into investigations, resignations, and permanent changes. All over a vehicle that existed to help people. All because someone mistook authority for immunity. If there's a lesson here, it isn't about HOAs or parking or even emergency services. It's about scale. About how small systems wield outsized power when they aren't challenged. About how rules reveal their true purpose when they're enforced without context or care. This didn't happen in a courtroom drama or a corporate boardroom. It happened on a quiet street with trimmed lawns and posted signs. It happened where most people assume nothing serious ever does. And that's the part that stays with me. If a single board member could do this with a clipboard and a contract, what could happen where you live?